A fire that climbed against nature's law. A mystery Holmes alone could face. Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. Drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. It was a bitterly cold January evening in the year 1896 when the incident, that would later come to be known as the fire that burned, upwards first came to our attention. Holmes and I were seated before the hearth at Baker Street, he with his long legs stretched across the Persian rug, his dressing gown cinched loosely about his frame, and I with a cup of strong Darjeeling in hand, attempting to keep the winter chill at bay. There had been no case for nearly a fortnight, an intolerable drought for my friend, who, deprived of mental stimulus, had begun showing all the signs of that peculiar restlessness which his idleness always provoked. The violin had made a tortured return, its strings groaning under bow strokes that were more aggressive than artistic. The monographs had been reopened and abandoned in succession. And once again the cocaine bottle had begun to emerge from its drawer with troubling regularity. It was at this moment of gathering gloom that Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door with her usual combination of courtesy and thinly veiled concern. "A gentleman, sir," she said. "He insists it's urgent." Holmes perked up instantly, the transformation in his demeanor so sudden as to be almost theatrical. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson. We must not stand in the way of urgency." Our visitor entered without delay, a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a countenance deeply furrowed by anxiety. He was plainly dressed but carried himself with the assurance of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, my name is Cedric Havisham. I come on behalf of Lady Aurelia Tinsley." Holmes gave a slight bow. "Lady Tinsley of Warwick Square? Yes, I believe I had occasion to deduce something about her cat once, from a torn envelope and a strand of saffron fur. Pray sit down, Mr. Havisham. You mentioned urgency. Has something happened to Lady Tinsley?" Havisham looked at us gravely. "To her house, Mr. Holmes. It burned down last night." Holmes's eyes flickered, the faintest glint of intrigue lighting them. "Tragic. But I assume there is more." "Indeed." The fire brigade was baffled. The fire began not on the ground floor, nor from the hearth as one might expect, but in the ceiling of the second-floor drawing room, and it burned. Upward. They say the flames licked against gravity itself. Lady Tinsley was fortunately away at a concert, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Fanwick, was found dead, burned beyond recognition. And something else, yes? Something odd was found on the floorboards of the attic. A scorched ring of salt, arranged, the inspector claims, in the shape of a circle, with symbols none of them could understand. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. Now we depart from the realm of the ordinary and enter the domain of the interesting. Scotland Yard is inclined to call it accidental, Havisham continued, a malfunctioning flue or a dropped oil lamp. But Lady Tinsley insists she heard footsteps above her room the night before, yet the attic was locked and the key accounted for. Holmes glanced at me. I could tell from his expression that our dry spell was at an end. "You've done wisely to come, Mr. Havisham," said he. "A fire that burns upward, footsteps in locked spaces, and a death cloaked in flame. These are not accidents. Dr. Watson, pack your bag. We leave for Warwick Square within the hour." And thus began the case that would take us into the ashes of aristocracy, through charred lies and hidden truths, toward the heart of a flame that, rather than consuming outward, seemed to reach inward, like guilt made visible. We arrived at Warwick Square under a sky the color of damp slate, the wind snapping at our coats as the carriage drew up before the blackened skeleton of what had once been a fine three-story townhouse. A constable stood watch at the gates, and the sour scent of smoke still clung to the air like an accusation. Holmes stepped lightly down and paused for a moment, surveying the ruin. His eyes, ever sharp, scanned not only the charred facade but also the cobbles, the gutters, and even the wrought iron fence, as though the building might reveal its secrets through its shadow. I had come to know that look well. It was not mere curiosity but a precise calculation, a mind already sifting possible from impossible. "Notice, Watson," he murmured, "that the windows of the upper floors are more damaged than those below. That is not the usual character of fire. Flame, like water, seeks its own level. It climbs, yes, but it does not start at the summit. Unless it is directed, We were met at the doorway by Lady Aurelia Tinsley herself. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with a stately air and a grief that sat heavily upon her shoulders. Her gown, though finely tailored, bore the signs of hasty dressing and a night without rest. I saw in her eyes a brittle tension, grief, yes, but something more. Fear, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I am grateful beyond words for your haste. Holmes bowed. The facts spoke for themselves, Lady Tinsley. Any delay would be unconscionable. Might we begin with a word regarding the household? Who was present in the house last evening? Myself, of course, though I had gone out by 6:30 for the concert at St. James's Hall. My maid, Lillian, had the evening off. Only Mrs. Fanwick remained behind, my housekeeper. She had complained of a headache and said she preferred to rest. She was found on the attic stairs. Holmes frowned very slightly. Not in her chambers? No, though I know not what would have drawn her up there. The attic was locked, as it always is, and the key is kept in my writing desk. No servant would go up unbidden. It is mainly used for old furniture and trunks. Who had access to the writing desk? Only myself. And Mr. Havisham, my solicitor, but I am quite certain the key had not been moved. May I see this desk? We followed her through the drawing room, now a cavern of scorched paneling and soot-flecked furniture. The fire had consumed much, but not everything. The air still pulsed with residual heat, as though the walls were reluctant to forget. The writing desk stood in a parlor off the main hallway, one of the few rooms largely untouched by the flames. Holmes opened the drawer indicated by Lady Tinsley and examined the small brass key within. He lifted it carefully with a handkerchief and turned it in his gloved palm. Not recently handled. No soot. And the dust in the corner of the drawer remains undisturbed. You are correct. The key was not used, and yet someone entered the attic. He paused, then addressed her gently. Lady Tinsley, may I ask, did Mrs. Fanwick have any family? Any conflicts in the household? Or perhaps peculiar interests? She was a widow, no children. She served me for 12 years. Devoted, if occasionally stern. As for peculiarities, well, now that you mention it, Lady Tinsley hesitated. She did keep to herself more than she once had. I assumed it was age or perhaps grief. But she had taken to collecting old books. Odd ones, foreign. Holmes's eyes glittered. I might see those if they survived. Of course. They were in her private closet on the top floor. What's left of it? The climb to the attic was sobering. The stairs bore clear signs of fire damage, blackened wood that creaked underfoot and patches where the wall plaster had blistered and fallen. Yet Holmes moved as nimbly as ever, pausing only once to crouch by the banister where he rubbed a patch of scorched floorboard with his thumb. There was an accelerant, he said flatly. Petroleum, perhaps. The residue clings beneath the soot, see here. He turned to me. The fire was not simply an accident. It was designed, with precision, and I dare say intent. At the attic landing, the door to Mrs. Fanwick's chamber hung half off its hinges, revealing a small, plainly furnished room. Remarkably, a cabinet within had escaped total ruin, its interior sheltered by the thick door and low ceiling. Holmes opened it and withdrew a singed volume. The pages were brittle at the edges, but the text was legible. Latin, he said after a moment. No, wait. This is not classical Latin. It's a dialect, perhaps ecclesiastical. And look, symbols. He turned the book toward me. Etched in the margins were small geometric figures, some familiar. Triangles, spirals. Others more arcane, like ciphers awaiting a key. Lady Tinsley, peering over his shoulder, drew back involuntarily. She kept that hidden. I never saw. What on earth could she have been reading? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he continued through the room, eyes alighting on a small brass pot blackened by fire. He examined the rim, sniffed it, then set it down with a strange smile. Salt, ash, and what I believe to be dried rosemary. A curious mixture. Not culinary, I should think. A ritual, I ventured. Holmes glanced at me approvingly. Possibly. And yet I suspect we must think more pragmatically. Not superstition, but simulation. Someone wanted to suggest a ritual, to plant the seed of it in the minds of observers. Hence the salt ring and the symbols. And the fire. Engineered. The origin point was here, at the attic landing, one floor above where Mrs. Fanwick was discovered. Yet she lies dead below. That, my dear Watson, is a contradiction. We left the ruin with minds churning. As we descended into the street, the wind carried a soft patter of ash around us. Holmes turned to Lady Tinsley. "I must speak with your solicitor again, Lady Tinsley. Mr. Havisham, does he live nearby?" "He keeps rooms on Grafton Street. I can have him summoned, no need. We shall call ourselves. And what do you suspect, Mr. Holmes? You suspect, Mr. Holmes? Holmes gave her a thin smile. "I suspect, madam, that your house was set alight not to destroy but to reveal. Or perhaps to distract. In either case, Mrs. Fanwick was not meant to die. That was an error." As we made our way down the street, I could no longer suppress the question that had been growing since we entered the house. "Holmes, you said the fire was designed with precision. But why would anyone orchestrate a fire that burns upward, defying its nature?" He looked at me gravely. "Because, Watson, only by burning upward could it reach what was meant to be found, or, just as likely, what was meant to be hidden." And with that he hailed a cab, murmuring as we climbed in, "To Grafton Street. The law is slow, but the truth moves swiftly, especially when chased by fire." Grafton Street in the early dusk was a mottled blend of gaslight and drifting fog, the sort of London evening that obscured more than it revealed. Our cab wound between carriages and bundled pedestrians until it stopped before a modest but dignified row of offices. A brass placard beside the door read Cedric Havisham, Solicitor and Commissioner for Oaths. Holmes, never one to waste a moment, led the way up the stairs, his footsteps brisk and unhesitating. We were admitted into Havisham's office by a young clerk who looked up nervously from his ink blotter and ushered us through to a back room paneled in dark wood and smelling faintly of old vellum and ink. Mr. Havisham rose as we entered, offering a brief, puzzled bow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I did not expect you again so soon. Has something developed?" Holmes wasted no time in pleasantries. "Several things, Mr. Havisham. Chief among them, an inconsistency that tugs at the threads of this fire. You are Lady Tinsley's legal representative. Might I ask when you last visited the house at Warwick Square?" "4 days ago, for the delivery of quarterly accounts. Lady Tinsley prefers our business conducted in person. I stayed perhaps an hour." "Did you access the desk where the attic key is kept?" "No," he said with confidence. Lady Tinsley retrieved the key herself to check something in a document safe. "I did not handle it, quite so." "Then you can confirm her account, that no one but she has had access to that desk since your visit, unless one of the staff defied orders and tampered with it, though I cannot imagine Mrs. Fanwick doing such a thing." Holmes seated himself with a swift, fluid motion, hands folded, eyes narrowing. "And yet, Mr. Havisham, someone did enter the attic. The door was locked, the key untouched, yet we found signs of activity that cannot be ignored. A circle of salt-burned remnants of herbs, a book written in ecclesiastical Latin, and a fire started from that very room." Havisham's brow furrowed. "I beg your pardon, did you say a book?" "Yes, a curious one. Latin annotations, occult symbols. Surely you, as Lady Tinsley's legal advisor, would be aware if a member of her household had taken an interest in such arcane matters." Havisham looked genuinely baffled. "I'm afraid I knew nothing of the sort. I was aware that Mrs. Fanwick was an intensely private woman, perhaps even secretive, but such eccentricities never crossed my notice." Holmes watched him closely. "And might I inquire into the matter of the house's insurance?" At this, Havisham straightened somewhat stiffly. "Yes, the property was insured. Against fire, among other things. Quite thoroughly, in fact. Lady Tinsley's late husband believed in robust policies. But Lady Tinsley has not made any claim yet, of course. She may not, depending on what the fire reveals." I saw Havisham's jaw tighten, though whether from offense or discomfort I could not be sure. Holmes stood, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "One last matter. Do you know of anyone who might bear a grudge against Lady Tinsley or her household? A dismissed servant, perhaps? Or an estranged relation?" "No dismissed servants that I know of." "But," he paused, "yes, there is her nephew, Edward Langmere, a rather unruly young man. He once stood to inherit something of a trust, but his gambling debts and poor associations caused Lady Tinsley to revise the will some months ago." "He did not take it well." Holmes nodded. "You are in possession of this revised will?" "Certainly. It is lodged in my safe. Would you be willing to show it to me?" Havisham hesitated only a moment before rising and walking to a wall cabinet. With a key from his watch chain, he unlocked the metal door and produced a folder of legal documents. Holmes accepted it and perused the papers with great care. I observed his fingers lingering on the name Edward Langmere, scrawled in fine copperplate under a heavily inked line of excision. Disinherited entirely, Holmes murmured. Curious, and yet the fire will have complicated probate. If Lady Tinsley were to perish before final amendments were registered, or the document destroyed. But she didn't, I said. She's alive. The fire occurred while she was out. Holmes looked up at me with that sharp sidelong glance that always meant he'd arrived at something before I had. Exactly, Watson. A fire that destroys nothing of legal consequence, and yet a woman is dead, and an attic long locked was suddenly active. He turned to Havisham. I thank you for your time. I would like your permission to speak to Edward Langmere. I believe he lodges now in Cheyne Walk, Chelsea. I can provide the address. Outside once more, Holmes hailed another cab, his lips tight and his eyes locked inward upon some private calculation. You have a theory, I said. I have a suspicion. And a puzzle yet to unravel. Langmere? Possibly. But if he is involved, I do not believe he lit the match himself. There is too much art in the details. Fires are brutish things, Watson. And yet this one behaved as if it followed a plan. An intellectual fire, you might say. One must always ask, what was it meant to consume and what was it meant to leave behind? We arrived at Cheyne Walk as the evening deepened into a hard iron darkness. The house we sought was one of a terrace overlooking the river, respectable enough, though the windows bore the yellowish cast of rooms not well aired. Holmes knocked briskly, and after some moments a man answered, tall and narrow-shouldered with a sharp nose and sunken cheeks that suggested prolonged discontent rather than illness. Yes? He asked coolly. Mr. Edward Langmere? I am, Sherlock Holmes. May we have a word? Langmere blinked, then stepped aside with reluctance. If this is about my aunt, I know what's happened. I read the papers. Holmes's gaze raked the room as we entered. It was cluttered, papers, empty glasses, a half-finished chessboard on a writing table, and a faint reek of stale tobacco and burnt candles. Then you'll know the fire began in a locked attic, Holmes said, and that your aunt was fortunately out of the house. Langmere gave a cold laugh. Fortunate for her. Unfortunate for Mrs. Fanwick, I suppose. Holmes was unblinking. How well did you know the housekeeper? Langmere shrugged. Hardly at all. She never liked me. Why not? Because I gambled, drank, lived freely. The woman was a Puritan in corsets. And you're aware your aunt disinherited you? Langmere's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But he only smiled thinly. Of course I know. She thought it would improve me. It didn't. Holmes drifted toward the writing table. You play chess. Occasionally. Holmes touched a piece, a knight mid-leap over a black pawn. And who plays white? No one, Langmere said. I play both sides. Helps me think. Holmes turned slowly. Then you'll understand this question. What sort of man plays both sides of a match, attacker and defender, and never truly wins? Langmere said nothing. Holmes gave a slight nod. We'll take no more of your time tonight. But I should warn you, if the fire at Warwick Square was no accident, then whoever lit it is playing a game more dangerous than chess. And with that, we stepped back into the street. As the cab bore us toward Baker Street, Holmes sat motionless, fingers together, brow furrowed in thought. What do you think of him? I asked. He is not the killer, Holmes said. But he may be the key. There's a player in this game hiding their face, Watson, and I believe they just sacrificed a housekeeper to protect the Queen. The next morning broke gray and sullen over Baker Street, with a drizzle fine enough to seep through wool and optimism alike. I found Holmes at the breakfast table untouched. Toast cooling beside a pot of tepid coffee, his fingers steepled and his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the ceiling. He had not spoken since rising, save to request silence. I had learned to respect such moods. They signified the delicate alignment of facts in his mind, as though his thoughts moved across a chessboard invisible to the rest of us. I was halfway through my second cup, when he finally stirred. Watson, what is missing? I blinked. From where? From the fire. From the attic. From the account of those involved. From the behavior of the deceased. What is not there that ought to be? I set my cup down. Well, you mentioned no sign of forced entry, and yet someone was clearly in the attic. There's no indication of theft, no valuables gone, and nothing was removed from the writing desk. Holmes gave a mild grunt. You are circling it. Think again of the scene. We have a locked attic. No one took the key. Yet someone entered. That suggests either another key or an entirely different means of access. A hidden door, perhaps? But something subtler still. Consider, why would one go to the attic without opening it through the usual method? What purpose would it serve? To avoid being noticed? Precisely, I felt a jolt of recognition. The salt ring. The strange book. The symbols. You said someone wanted to suggest a ritual. Correct. And here we come to the heart of it, Watson. The scene was not meant to remain a secret. It was designed to be found. Therefore, the real secret lies not in what was left, but in what was meant to distract. At that precise moment, a sharp rap sounded at the door, and Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. A young constable entered, a fresh-faced man with the stiff bearing of one unaccustomed to Baker Street's eccentricities. "Inspector Lestrade's compliments, sir. He says he's not entirely convinced anymore that the fire was accidental. There's a new development." Holmes rose at once. "Go on." "The coroner's report has come in, sir. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fanwick, she didn't die from burns." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Go on." "She died from blunt force trauma. A heavy blow to the back of the skull. The fire came after. That changed everything." Within the hour, we were back at Scotland Yard, the familiar clatter and stink of bureaucracy giving way to Lestrade's cluttered office. He met us with his usual mixture of suspicion and reluctant admiration. "I suppose you'll say you knew it all along, Holmes." "Not all, Lestrade." Holmes replied mildly, taking a seat. "Only that the fire concealed more than it destroyed. Now we are certain of it." Lestrade passed across a folder. "Clean blow just above the nape. Possibly with a metal object, no weapon recovered. She was dead before the flames reached her." "And the symbols?" Holmes asked. Lestrade scoffed. "Superstitious rubbish. The occult, if you ask me. But I can't make sense of it. Some of the boys think it's devil worship. I say it's theater." "Exactly," Holmes murmured. "Theater. And Mrs. Fanwick was its unwilling audience." He stood and paced. "So someone kills a housekeeper, sets fire to the attic to suggest an accident, or, more cynically, a ritual gone wrong, and ensures Lady Tinsley is elsewhere for the evening. Convenient, is it not?" "But who?" I asked. "Langmuir?" "No," Holmes said. "He's a rogue, but not a strategist. He lacks the meticulous care required to stage such a scene. The game is being played by someone with access to the house, knowledge of its layout, and a cold sense of timing." Lestrade frowned. "Well, if not Langmuir, Mr. Havisham," Holmes said softly. The inspector blinked. "The solicitor? But consider his advantages. He knows the contents of the will. He knows when Lady Tinsley will be absent. He has reason to eliminate any obstacle that could disclose his manipulation, and he knows how to stage a distraction. The ritual elements, the symbols, the salt, are designed not merely to mislead the police, but to muddy the waters of probate, perhaps cast doubt on Lady Tinsley's mental faculties or the stability of the household. And Mrs. Fanwick. She may have discovered something. Perhaps she saw Havisham in the attic when he should not have been there. Perhaps she confronted him, and for that she was silenced. But the attic was locked, he couldn't have gotten in. Holmes's eyes gleamed. That is what I intend to prove. That evening, under cover of gathering fog, we returned once more to Warwick Square. Lady Tinsley had vacated the premises for safety, leaving the house in the care of a single constable. Holmes spent nearly an hour moving from room to room, examining thresholds, floorboards, and the charred remains of walls with a jeweler's loop and a length of thin wire. In the attic he spent the longest time, tapping along one paneled wall with a tuning fork until he stopped abruptly and turned to me. "Here." He pressed at a joint in the panel, and with a creak and a cloud of soot, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow crawl space between the attic wall and the neighboring townhouse. This row of houses shares architectural features, a relic of their original builder's design. This passage would allow access from one attic to the next, and with the correct timing one could slip in, stage a scene, and vanish without ever using the door. I stared at the narrow blackness. So Havisham entered from the adjoining house, likely rented for the purpose or temporarily occupied. We shall discover that soon enough. Holmes turned, now alight with certainty. We must confront him, but not with accusation. No, Watson. We must invite him to trap himself. The following morning, Holmes sent a note to Mr. Havisham, requesting his presence at Baker Street for clarification of legal technicalities arising from the estate. He arrived promptly at noon, prim and courteous as ever, though a touch more pale than I recalled. Holmes greeted him warmly and gestured toward the armchair by the fire. "My dear Mr. Havisham, thank you for coming. I've been reviewing some notes from Warwick Square and came across a rather troubling discrepancy." Havisham stiffened. "Oh?" "Yes," Holmes said, taking up a pipe and lighting it with leisurely grace. "It concerns the attic fire. Scotland Yard now believes Mrs. Fanwick was murdered prior to the fire. A heavy blow, and, most curiously, the attic was accessed, though not by the key in Lady Tinsley's desk." Havisham's hands remained still in his lap, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something too quick to be named. Holmes leaned forward. "We also discovered a concealed passage between the attics of the neighboring homes. Ingenious, really. And it occurred to me, only someone with intimate knowledge of the property's architecture could have known of it." Silence stretched. Finally, Havisham spoke. "This is a dangerous accusation, Mr. Holmes." "No accusation," Holmes said calmly. "Only facts. Though I wonder what sort of person would possess both the legal knowledge to profit from a will's delay and the theatrical sensibility to stage an occult scene." Now Havisham's voice grew cold. "You can prove none of this." Holmes smiled thinly. "Perhaps not yet, but I believe you'll try to cover your tracks soon, and when you do, Scotland Yard will be ready." As Havisham stood, gloves in hand, and made for the door, Holmes added one last note. "One other thing. Did you know Mrs. Fanwick had begun keeping a journal? Private thoughts, suspicions. She hid it behind a loose stone in the fireplace. It was singed but legible." Havisham froze, and Holmes, ever the master of the unseen move, allowed him to walk out the door, right into the arms of two plainclothes officers waiting below. Holmes sat back, eyes half-lidded, a man who tries to erase evidence by fire. Watson often forgets, ashes remember. And so, we drew one step closer to the truth. Yet even as the solicitor was led away, Holmes looked to the window, the fog outside still thick and inscrutable. "There is still something that does not fit," he murmured. And I, knowing him as I did, understood. The game was not over. Not yet. It was 2 days after Mr. Cedric Havisham's arrest, and the newspapers were awash with breathless reports of the scandal, solicitor implicated in Warwick Square blaze, and devilry and death in a lady's drawing room, though, of course, Holmes had declined to speak with any journalist. He had more pressing matters to consider, and if the public chose to fixate on tales of occult sacrifice and unholy rites, he let them. But within the privacy of Baker Street, Holmes was unsettled. "There is a fracture in the narrative," he muttered, pacing before the fireplace in his dressing gown, his eyes flicking from rug to hearth to window as though they each held some hidden phrase he had overlooked. "You've secured the killer," I pointed out. "Scotland Yard has Havisham in custody. Lady Tinsley is safe, and no one has yet questioned your discovery of the attic passage. By all accounts, the case is concluded." Holmes stopped pacing only long enough to send a flat glance in my direction. "You recall my comment about what was missing from the scene, Watson?" "I do. You said the fire wasn't meant to destroy but to distract, correct? And we have followed that thread admirably. The ritual was a fiction. The fire was a screen. But now I ask myself, what was it really hiding?" I hesitated. "You believe there is another layer to this?" "I believe that Mrs. Fanwick's murder, while instrumental to the deception, was not its primary purpose. But Havisham was capable of murder, yes. But is he capable of conjuring an entire mythology? Of devising symbols, creating an illusion of esoteric knowledge? I think not. That requires a particular mind." Holmes walked to the cabinet and withdrew the half-burned book we had recovered from Mrs. Fanwick's closet. He laid it gently on the desk and opened to the pages marked with soot and curled edges. "These symbols," he said, tracing one with his finger, "are not random. They are fragments adapted from Renaissance alchemical texts, not the sort of material a solicitor stumbles upon." He turned sharply to me. "I need to know who introduced Mrs. Fanwick to this material. If she did not invent it herself, and I believe she did not, then someone guided her to it. Someone she trusted. Perhaps someone within the house." I straightened. "You think she was manipulated?" "Yes, Watson. groomed in a manner of speaking to adopt certain beliefs, perhaps slowly, subtly, and then, when her utility ended, eliminated. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a tray. "A young lady to see you. Mr. Holmes. She says she was in service at Warwick Square." Holmes took the card and read it aloud. "Miss Lillian Harrow, Lady Tinsley's maid." "Show her in, Mrs. Hudson." A moment later the maid entered, a woman of about 26, plainly dressed but with a clear, composed manner. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though she held her posture with quiet resolve. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for receiving me. I didn't know if I ought to come. But since the fire, I've had no rest from my thoughts." "Please sit," Holmes said, motioning to the chair opposite him. "Begin at the beginning, Miss Harrow." She nodded. "It's Mrs. Fanwick, sir. Everyone says she must have lost her senses before the fire, that she was studying strange things, making symbols, that she brought this on herself. But I don't believe that. She was strict, yes, but clear-minded. Until, well, about 3 months ago." Holmes leaned forward. "Go on." She began receiving letters. Never through the regular post. They would just appear, slipped under her door or folded into a book. At first she didn't mention them, but I noticed her manner changed. She'd talk to herself late at night. I heard her whispering sometimes words that weren't English. "Did you ever see these letters?" She shook her head. She always burned them after reading. But she kept the book, said it helped her understand the messages better. I thought someone must be playing a trick on her. But she believed it. "Do you know if anyone else saw these letters?" Miss Harrow hesitated. "There was one man, Mr. Nathaniel Griggs. He visited now and then, said he was from the Historical Society. He'd bring old maps or papers to show Lady Tinsley, but he always spoke privately with Mrs. Fanwick afterward." I thought it odd. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Griggs, you say? Did he leave a card?" "No, sir. But he said he worked out of a reading room on Bell Street, near Paddington." Holmes stood at once. "You've been most helpful, Miss Harrow. Please, leave your address with Mrs. Hudson in case we need to speak again." After she had gone, Holmes turned to me with eyes alight. "A new player, Watson. One who operated from the shadows. If Havisham staged the legal side of this deception, Griggs may be the one who built the mask." We arrived at Bell Street just after 3, the drizzle still thick as soup. The reading room in question was a dusty affair, poorly lit and half forgotten. A man in horn-rimmed spectacles behind the desk confirmed that a Mr. Griggs had used their archive on and off for several months. Holmes asked to see the sign-in ledger. "Note the dates," he murmured, pointing to a series of entries. "Griggs was here precisely every second Tuesday for 5 months, but he stopped appearing shortly after the fire. Do we have an address?" The clerk shrugged. "Only Kensal Green. Not very helpful." "On the contrary," Holmes said. "Extremely helpful. If I wished to vanish into the haze of London with a pocket full of secrets and a taste for ritual misdirection, Kensal Green, with its labyrinth of lodgings and decaying grandeur, would be ideal." Holmes sent 2 telegrams at once, one to Inspector Lestrade requesting a search of local registries, and another to an informant known only as Slatterly, a man whose peculiar talents included locating those who preferred not to be found. By the following evening, we had our reply. Griggs had taken a room above a shuttered tobacconist's on Harrow Road, under the name Nathan Abel. We went at once. The landlady let us in with some reluctance, citing a week's unpaid rent and an uneasiness about the lodger's late-night habits. Holmes ascended the stairs cautiously, pistol drawn. But the room was empty but not untouched. The walls were lined with clippings, newspaper articles on fires, deaths, occult theories, the same strange symbols repeated in charcoal on the wallpaper. And on the desk, a stack of letters, each addressed simply to MF and signed with the initials NG. Holmes flipped through them, his face grim. He wrote to her under a pseudonym, encouraged her studies, spoke of ancient truths, purification, destiny, slowly building a false world around her. I felt a chill. He manipulated her into thinking she was chosen, perhaps even convinced her she was part of something sacred. And then, Holmes nodded, and then fed her to Havisham's scheme when it suited him. I stared at the walls, the papers, the symbols painted like a private language of madness. What kind of man does this, Holmes? Holmes's voice was quiet. A man who views other people's minds as laboratories, who sees belief as a tool. A man like Nathaniel Griggs, or whatever his true name is, does not kill out of passion. He orchestrates ruin. Holmes straightened, eyes sharp once more. Now we have our true adversary, and I intend to find him before he decides to vanish again. This time for good. The following morning found Holmes in one of his most intense phases of cerebral activity, a condition in which, as I had come to learn, he neither spoke nor moved for hours on end. He sat cross-legged in his armchair with a sheaf of Griggs's letters spread on his lap, the fire crackling low and forgotten. I refrained from disturbing him and instead busied myself with rereading my notes, which now formed a curious mosaic of layered deceit. Mrs. Fanwick, an unsuspecting housekeeper, had been manipulated into absorbing occult material by a man she believed to be a scholar. Cedric Havisham, meanwhile, had his own game, using the staged ritual and fire as a smokescreen for a crime motivated by inheritance. And yet, through all of this, Nathaniel Griggs, or whatever his true identity, remained one step removed. Orchestrator, not executor, his motives, unlike Havisham's, were still cloaked in shadow. It was nearing 10 when Holmes finally stirred. "Watson," he said without preamble, "what is the connection between fire and belief?" I looked up from my notebook. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Consider Griggs's obsession," Holmes continued, rising and walking to the window. "Every letter of his that we recovered uses the metaphor of fire as transformation, purification, enlightenment, rebirth. It appears repeatedly. To Mrs. Fanwick he wrote of ascending in flame and casting off the weight of earth. Religious imagery? Worse, philosophical delusion. He believes in transcendence through destruction, or more precisely, he wants others to believe in it so that he may observe what they do. An experiment? Holmes nodded. Yes, a controlled trial, one might say. He creates a myth, selects a subject, and watches the result. Fanwick was his latest, but perhaps not his first. He retrieved a map from the side table and spread it over the desk. Red pins marked a scattered pattern across London. These are the locations of unexplained domestic fires in the past 18 months, most dismissed as accidents. But note the clustering: Chelsea, Clerkenwell, and now Warwick Square. In each, an older, solitary individual died. In each, occult symbols were later reported, though in no case were they taken seriously. You believe Griggs staged them all? I believe he tested different narratives. And in Warwick Square he found a convergence. A susceptible subject, an ambitious solicitor, and a household with secrets. A perfect laboratory. I stared at the map. So this man is no simple killer. He's conducting philosophical arson. Holmes arched an eyebrow. A poetic phrase, Watson, and not wholly inaccurate. At that moment a knock sounded. It was Inspector Lestrade. You've a gift for timing, Lestrade, Holmes said, ushering him in. Do you have him? We might, the inspector said, holding up a crumpled note. From your contact, Slatterly, says a man answering Griggs's description-booked passage under the name Edward Gressley, steamer bound for Antwerp. He's set to depart this evening from the docks at Millwall. Docks at Millwall. Docks. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then he means to flee. Not if we stop him, Lestrade replied. I've already arranged a team at the port, but I'd feel a damn sight better if you were there. Holmes gave a curt nod. We'll leave at once. Watson, your revolver. The docks at Millwall were cloaked in fog and movement, a confusion of crates, steam, and seagull cries. Men shouted as they loaded cargo onto the SS Cardia, its iron hull looming in the gloom like the flank of a slumbering beast. Lanterns swung on poles. The smell of salt and coal filled the air. Lestrade had positioned his men at the gangplank and exit gates. Holmes, meanwhile, led us behind a stack of barrels near the boarding area, where we had a clear view of those queuing to board. There, Holmes said suddenly, and I followed his gaze. A man had just emerged from the shadows of the customs office. He wore a flat cap pulled low and a coat turned up against the damp. In his hand was a leather satchel. That's him, Lestrade whispered. Holmes nodded. I've no doubt. But don't move yet. We watched as the man approached the queue, his gait steady but cautious. As he handed over his papers to the purser, Holmes stepped out from cover and spoke with calm finality. Mr. Griggs, or should I say, Gressley, you won't be sailing tonight. The man turned slowly. His face was thinner than in the reading room, his beard trimmed, but the eyes, piercing, intelligent, utterly cold, remained unmistakable. He did not bolt. He did not even flinch. I wondered how long it would take you, he said. His voice was unhurried, even amused. Mr. Holmes, I presume. And Dr. Watson, how satisfying. Lestrade moved in swiftly. Nathaniel Griggs, I am arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to murder and arson. Still, the man showed no alarm. You misunderstand me, Inspector. I lit no fires. I raised no hand against the dead. If others chose to act upon certain ideas, that is no crime of mine. Holmes stepped forward. Ideas you planted. Lies you cultivated like weeds. You fed madness to a lonely woman and waited to see what would grow. Griggs tilted his head. And yet you cannot prove a single thing I wrote was untrue. Belief, Mr. Holmes, is not a crime. Holmes regarded him with an expression I could not immediately interpret. Pity? Contempt? Perhaps both, no, Mr. Griggs, but murder is, and manipulation that leads directly to murder, is something the law is learning to recognize. I'll see to it you're the precedent. Lestrade clapped the irons on his wrists, and for the first time something flickered behind Griggs's eyes. Not fear, not regret, but something like boredom, as if the game had concluded earlier than he wished. As he was led away, I turned to Holmes. Do you think he'll be convicted? Holmes's expression was unreadable. With the evidence from the letters, Miss Harrow's testimony, and Mrs. Fanwick's journal, likely, but even if not, his usefulness to himself is over. He won't find another subject so easily. His methods are known now, and minds are harder to bend once the mask has been removed. We watched the fog close over the quay as the ship prepared to depart, without its strangest passenger, Holmes, lit a cigarette and stood in silence for a moment, then said quietly, There are fires that burn upward, Watson, against gravity, against logic. They are fanned by belief, sustained by suggestion, but they always collapse eventually, because reality, like truth, pulls everything back down. And with that, we turned and walked into the gray light of morning, the final ember of the case still glowing faintly behind us. We returned to Baker Street with the peculiar weight that often follows the closure of a difficult case. Not quite satisfaction, nor fatigue, but something quieter, more subdued. Holmes, for all his triumph in exposing Nathaniel Griggs and Cedric Havisham, showed little of his usual flourish. He remained pensive, sifting through the ash of the affair as though still seeking something not yet revealed. I cannot rid myself of the thought, he said to me later that afternoon, as we sat by the hearth, that we have only dimly perceived the full shape of this business. But Griggs is in custody, I replied, and Havisham faces trial. Both are implicated clearly. What remains? Holmes tapped his fingertips together. Griggs was an instigator, Havisham an opportunist. Yet the fire at Warwick Square was no spontaneous event. It was choreographed, not merely to conceal a body, but to construct a particular narrative. The ritual, I said, yes, and the implication that madness had infected the household. But what if the story wasn't intended solely to mislead the police? What if it was also meant to destroy someone else's credibility? I frowned. You're referring to Lady Tinsley? Holmes nodded. Consider the scene from her perspective. A trusted housekeeper begins behaving erratically. Symbols appear. Books in foreign tongues are discovered. A fire breaks out in a locked room, followed by whispers of occultism. Now imagine if the police had truly accepted that version, that Lady Tinsley had encouraged it, or worse, believed it herself. Discrediting her entirely, I murmured, seeing now what Holmes had begun to suspect. So the scheme had a tertiary target. Exactly. Havisham's motive, we knew, was financial. He stood to benefit from confusion around the estate. But someone took great care to ensure that Lady Tinsley's name would not emerge untarnished even if she lived. Holmes rose and crossed to his desk. He pulled a sheet of paper from beneath his blotter and handed it to me. A will, more precisely, an older version of Lady Tinsley's will. This one dated 6 months prior to the current version, and still bearing the name Edward Langmuir among the beneficiaries. I glanced up. Where did you get this? It was submitted anonymously to the Public Records Office 3 days after the fire. Had I not placed a watch on unusual documents tied to the Tinsley name, it would have gone unnoticed. I read further. The bequest to Langmuir was generous, half the estate. But in the newer version, signed weeks before the fire, his name had been struck out entirely. This older will, had it surfaced first, could easily have cast doubt upon the new one's validity. particularly in light of a household steeped in seeming chaos. "It's a forgery," I said. Holmes nodded. "Yes, a very convincing one. But there are telltale errors. A misused semicolon, a slight slant in the witness signature. I've examined Lady Tinsley's authentic documents. This was copied, likely by someone with access to the earlier papers, which leads us to only one logical conclusion: Langmuir." Indeed, I stood slowly. "But you said he wasn't the killer." "He isn't. Nor is he clever enough to craft such an elaborate misdirection. But he's clever enough to borrow from those who are. Imagine, Watson, a desperate man recently cut out of a fortune, who learns that his aunt's solicitor is planning to manipulate a fire for legal advantage. He sees an opportunity. All he must do is nudge events toward confusion, allow Griggs and Havisham to conduct their schemes, and then insert his own forgery at the right moment. To muddy the inheritance. More than that. To create a legal morass. If the newer will is disputed, the estate reverts to the previous one. Langmuir wins. I was silent a moment. "Do you have proof?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Only that which convinces the reasonable mind. But perhaps enough to compel a confession. We found Edward Langmuir at his lodgings in Cheyne Walk once again, this time less debonair than before. He wore a fraying dressing gown and had the look of a man who had overestimated his own cleverness and was now watching the tide come in." Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Langmuir, a forged will bearing your name has surfaced. You submitted it or arranged for it to be submitted, on the assumption that Lady Tinsley would be declared unstable, or dead, and that questions around the fire would invalidate her final wishes." Langmuir scoffed. "That's absurd." "No, Mr. Langmuir," Holmes said, stepping forward. "It's perfectly logical. All you needed was chaos. You didn't have to light the match, just wait for someone else to do so. Mrs. Fanwick's behavior manipulated by Griggs, the murder committed by Havisham, and you, standing in the wings with a forged will and a motive soaked in desperation." Langmuir's mask cracked. "I didn't kill anyone." "I know. But you profited from death. And the law does not look kindly on vultures, even those who wait politely for the feast to begin." Langmuir's hands twitched. "What do you want from me?" "A signed confession," Holmes said, "and the name of your forger. In return, I will speak to the Crown Prosecutor. Perhaps the court will distinguish between instigator and parasite." For several long seconds, Langmuir said nothing. Then slowly he reached for a notepad. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in his chair, his usual clarity restored. "So now all the players stand revealed," he said. "Griggs, the manipulator. Havisham, the killer. Langmuir, the forger. And Mrs. Fanwick," Holmes added softly, "the victim of them all. She believed herself chosen. In truth, she was selected, used, discarded. I could not help but feel the heaviness of it. And Lady Tinsley? She will recover. The courts will recognize the fraud. Her fortune is secure. Her name, too." We sat in silence for a while. Holmes eventually lit his pipe, puffing thoughtfully. "This case, Watson, has troubled me not because of its difficulty, but because of its elegance. Each man acted according to self-interest, but their actions aligned so neatly one might almost believe in fate." He turned toward me, smoke curling upward between us. "But there is no fate. Only design. And in design, Watson, lie the fingerprints of truth." And so concluded the affair of the fire that burned upward, not driven by madness or magic, but by greed, belief, and opportunity. 3 men, 1 victim. And beneath it all, the same eternal force Holmes had always pursued. Reason, cutting cleanly through smoke and flame alike. The final days of the case saw Holmes in a rare mood, not triumphant, but contemplative. There had been no clever escape, no dramatic showdown at the moors or racing through fog-bound alleys. And yet, the matter of the fire that burned upwards had demanded of him something even more taxing than adrenaline. Patience. Precision. The quiet excavation of lies embedded so deeply in appearances that even the truth had seemed fraudulent. On a dull Thursday afternoon, we found ourselves once more seated in our rooms at Baker Street, the fire reduced to a flicker, the fog at the window a pale ghost against the pane. Holmes sat in his armchair, polishing his pipe, though I noted he had yet to light it. You seem troubled, I ventured. Troubled, no. But unsatisfied, perhaps. He paused. Cases in which justice is secured are not always those that feel most complete. But the culprits have been exposed, I said. Griggs is in custody, Havisham awaits trial, and Langmuir's confession has safeguarded Lady Tinsley's estate. What remains? Closure, Watson, Holmes said softly, which none of them will ever truly receive. He rose then, walked to the mantel, and picked up a small envelope resting beside the clock. With a glance toward me, he opened it, removed a sheet of thick paper, and began to read aloud. Mr. Holmes, I wish to express my profound gratitude for the preservation of my family name and legacy. The destruction of my home, while terrible, has reminded me of the ease with which foundations, both material and moral, may be shaken. I am told you pursued this matter not for fame or favor, but out of a belief in truth. I find myself indebted. Lady Aurelia Tinsley Holmes folded the note and returned it to its envelope. She is a woman of remarkable resilience, he said. But this business will haunt her. As it will many, I replied. There was a knock at the door and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a small brown parcel. She handed it to Holmes with a faint look of disapproval. It came by private messenger, she said. No return address. Holmes nodded, thanked her, and waited until she had closed the door before opening the string. Inside was a book. Charred at the corners, the spine warped from heat, but unmistakably familiar. The Latin volume, I said. From Mrs. Fanwick's collection. Holmes turned it in his hands, then opened to the flyleaf. There, in a thin, spidery hand, was a new inscription, for the one who reads without belief, who sees the fire but not the flame. He showed it to me. A taunt? Perhaps, he said. Or a farewell. I leaned closer. Do you believe Griggs sent this? It bears his signature, certainly, but not his hand. Holmes closed the book and set it aside. No, I think this comes from someone who admired his work, or was part of it. You mean he had accomplices? Holmes turned back to the fire. Not accomplices in the traditional sense, but followers, perhaps. I do not believe Griggs operated in a vacuum. His ideas, mad though they may seem, have a certain seductive logic to them. For the disillusioned or the isolated, belief offers purpose, certainty, control. I considered that. Then you think there could be others like Mrs. Fanwick, still being influenced? He nodded slowly. It is possible. His letters were carefully worded, generalized, designed to be universal. I suspect he used the same format with multiple recipients, and now that he is imprisoned, one of them may feel emboldened. That thought chilled me. So, the case is not finished. No, Watson, he said. The event is over. The inquiry is not. He retrieved a fresh notebook and began scribbling. I shall compile a list, he said absently. Names of anyone connected to Griggs's false society. Libraries he used, gatherings he attended, pamphlets he distributed. We must trace the web, find the center. I knew better than to interrupt when Holmes entered this phase of focused deduction. I poured myself a brandy and sat silently, the room quiet, but for the scratching of his pen. After a time he looked up. There was one other detail, Watson, something we overlooked. Oh? The day Mrs. Fanwick was killed, she sent a letter. A real one. It never arrived at its destination. Do we know to whom it was addressed? Holmes rose and pulled open a drawer in his desk. From it, he withdrew a half-burnt envelope recovered from the wreckage. The address was smudged, the ink warped but still legible. Miss Elsie Bream, C.O. St. Catherine's Home, Eastbourne. Who is she? A former maid, Holmes replied. Dismissed quietly last year. Rumors of mental instability, though nothing confirmed. I had set it aside, thinking it unrelated. But now, you believe she may have received letters too, or witnessed something she was told to forget. That very afternoon, we departed for Eastbourne. St. Catherine's Home stood atop a windswept cliff, its pale bricks battered by sea air and decades of salt. Inside, the halls were clean but austere, and the matron, a kindly but cautious woman, regarded us with wary eyes until Holmes explained our errand. "Miss Bream has been with us nearly 10 months," she said. "She does not speak often. She writes in a journal and draws." "May we speak with her?" The matron hesitated. "She frightens easily. But I think, yes, she has mentioned a Mr. Griggs once before." We didn't know what to make of it. We were led to a small garden at the rear of the building. There, seated on a bench, was a young woman with pale hair and a distant, unfocused gaze. She held a pencil in one hand and a thick sketch pad in the other. "Miss Bream," Holmes said gently. She looked up. For a moment, confusion clouded her features. Then something flickered. Recognition, or perhaps just memory. "You've come from the fire," she said softly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Do you remember a man named Griggs?" She nodded. "He said he could make me see again," she murmured. "Not with my eyes, but through meaning. He said I had to unlearn what the world taught." "And Mrs. Fanwick?" Miss Bream blinked rapidly. He sent her the same words. But she believed too much. She tried the ritual alone. I warned her not to. Holmes crouched beside her. "Did you write her a letter?" "I told her it wasn't real. That he just wanted to watch. That he didn't believe in anything." She clutched the sketch pad tighter. "But he made us believe. Just enough." Holmes reached out gently. "May I see what you've drawn?" With trembling hands, she opened the pad. Page after page of symbols, circles, flames, staircases leading into clouds. But one image froze us both. A man, tall, bearded, his eyes hidden by shadow, and behind him a wall covered in shelves of books and an odd circular window, a room I recognized at once, the reading room on Bell Street. "You drew this from memory?" I asked. Miss Bream nodded. "He said we should never forget. He said someone had to remember if he couldn't." Holmes exhaled slowly. "We must return to London," he said quietly. "For what?" "To examine the books Griggs left behind." He straightened, a strange light behind his eyes. "Because I no longer believe this was his first experiment, only his most visible, and thus the fire that burned upward left behind not only soot and ash, but the first whisper of a greater darkness, a signal flare in a city too ready to dismiss smoke as mist and madness as belief." The journey back to London was undertaken in silence. Holmes, deeply absorbed in his own thoughts, stared out at the gray landscape streaking past the carriage windows, his mind, if I knew him at all, working furiously beneath that still exterior. I refrained from speaking. He had entered what I privately called the spiral, that state in which 100 puzzle pieces had begun to slot into place, but only one piece remained stubbornly absent, and it was always that final fragment. That drove him, sometimes for days until he had dragged it into the light. We arrived in Baker Street just after nightfall. A steady rain tapped at the window panes like a soft accusation. Holmes wasted no time in changing his clothes and donning a fresh collar, fastening it with a thin jet pin I hadn't seen him wear in years. "You're going back to Bell Street," I said. "Not back," he corrected. "Forward." "Then I'm coming with you. Then I'm coming with you." He did not object. We hailed a cab and made our way once more to that curious corner of Paddington, where the old reading room sat under a flickering gas lamp, its windows fogged with moisture and secrets. The building appeared closed for the night, but Holmes produced a key, not one stolen, but borrowed, I suspect, from a contact whose name I would never learn, and led us quietly inside. The interior was just as we had left it. Dust settled like snow over ancient spines. The silence was complete, broken only by our soft steps over the wooden floorboards. Holmes moved with purpose to the rear of the room, where a small alcove housed a private reference collection. It was here Griggs had spent most of his hours, reviewing not the volumes of theology or history, but a narrow, specific collection of pseudoscientific works. I saw at once what Holmes meant. Every book bore similar annotations in the margins. Small, precise handwriting, observation symbols. "Not just a reader," Holmes said, scanning the margins. A collector. A curator. He was building something here. But to what end? I asked. Holmes turned to me. You recall Miss Bream's drawing? I nodded. The man. The window. The bookcases. Holmes pointed to the far wall of the reading room. There, behind a now-drawn curtain, was that same circular window, exactly as she had drawn it. She never returned here after her breakdown, he said quietly, and yet she remembered every detail. Which means she was brought here, I said. Not just corresponding from afar? Exactly. Griggs brought her. Likely brought others. They gathered here. Holmes retrieved one of the annotated volumes and turned it to the inside back cover. A single sheet of thick vellum had been pasted in. On it was a list of initials, each followed by a symbol. FC, EB, HSMF Fanwick, I murmured. Bream, the others? We must find them. Holmes pocketed the sheet and turned to leave, but then he paused. Wait, he stooped, reaching for a loose floorboard behind the base of the shelving. With a careful tug, he lifted it free, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside was a wooden box. He drew it out and opened it slowly. Within were stacks of papers, letters folded into thirds, most written in the same hand we now recognized as Griggs's. There were notes detailing correspondence with subjects, pages of philosophical ramblings, and, most chilling, small observations logged with clinical detachment. Subject MF displays high susceptibility. Believes herself called. No need for further reinforcement. Instability observed in linguistic confusion. Recommend final trigger before equinox. Subject HS rejected symbolic language. Ceased contact. Archive retained. Subject EB responded well to dual exposure, flame and water. Dissociation increasing. Risk of breakpoint within 2 months. Recommend withdrawal of contact and observation at distance. Holmes read the notes in silence, his jaw tightening. This was no accident, Watson. This was method. Measured, studied. He was selecting vulnerable minds and applying pressure like a scientist prodding a specimen in a glass box. I felt cold, and when the subject broke, he retreated, disappeared, repeated the process. Holmes drew out the final document, a folded sheet, newer than the rest. The ink had barely faded. It read, "If this box is found, it is because I allowed it to be. You believe you've cornered the mind behind the fire, but the fire was only the first trial. The next moves are no longer mine to make. Others will carry it forward." The wheel turns. There was no signature. Holmes closed the box and stood. His face was unreadable. "What does it mean?" I asked. He answered slowly. "It means that Griggs saw himself not as an individual but as a catalyst. His purpose was not to enact destruction himself, but to awaken those who would. He planted ideology like seed, and now others may feel they are the harvest." A long silence stretched between us. I broke it finally by saying what I feared. "Do you believe there will be another fire?" Holmes nodded. Not a literal one, perhaps, but yes. Somewhere someone else is already constructing a fiction, a symbol, a lie wrapped in truth, and they'll believe they came to it on their own. He paused, then added, "We must find them before they find each other." Over the following week, Holmes moved with ferocious intensity. He requested files from psychiatric hospitals, wrote to 3 university libraries about recent thefts of occult literature, and interviewed a clergyman in Whitechapel who reported 2 parishioners claiming to have seen the fire in the mind's eye. The pattern was widening, and still the central thread remained Griggs, or rather, what Griggs had unleashed. On a rainy Wednesday, a package arrived at Baker Street addressed to Holmes in a tidy but unfamiliar hand. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single object, a wax seal, the kind once used to stamp letters. The sigil was simple, 2 triangles, one pointing upward, the other down. Interlocked, the same symbol we had seen in the attic. With it was a note. "You saw the smoke. But the fire was always meant for the minds that followed. There is no center. Only circles." Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached for his pen and began to write. "To whom?" I asked. "To Mycroft," he said. "This may extend beyond London." "And you?" He looked up, eyes clear and tense. "I intend to follow every ember, Watson. Until the last smoke fades," I nodded. "Then so will I." And with that we turned back to the widening ring left behind by the fire that burned upwards. A circle of deception, belief and calculated madness still glowing hot beneath the ashes. The fire had gone out. and yet its warmth lingered not in the hearth, but in the threads of the case that refused to cool. For days after that final message, Holmes remained alert, wired as if a signal might come at any moment. He slept less, spoke less. The detective who had once paced for want of a challenge now sat for hours in stillness, studying the letters Griggs had written, tracing symbols across the margins of ancient texts with a fingertip as though he might find a pattern hidden beneath the ink itself. It was on a wind-torn evening, the sky bleeding rain, that I returned to Baker Street from a late call at St. Bartholomew's to find Holmes seated at the window, gazing out into the gloom. He did not turn when I entered. "It's begun," he said simply. I set my umbrella aside. "What has?" "Another fire. This time in Lambeth, a boarding house. One fatality, a man named Peter Winston, a poet of minor reputation and, more importantly, a former reader at Bell Street." I frowned. "You think he was one of the initials in Griggs's ledger?" "I know he was. The initials PW appeared once in the margins of a volume on Gnostic heresies. I missed it. Now he's dead." I took a breath. "Arson?" "Undetermined, according to Lestrade. But the fire started in the ceiling again, and there was a salt ring near the door, obscured, almost washed away by the firefighters." Holmes stood and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson. One more time into the ash." The boarding house in Lambeth was little more than a crumbling pile of brick and iron, soaked through and reeking of damp. The fire had already been extinguished. A constable led us through what remained of the upper floor. Charred beams hung like broken ribs. On the far wall, etched in soot, was a faint pattern, spirals interlocked with triangles now barely visible. "The same symbol," I murmured. Holmes crouched by the blackened hearth. He picked up a small metal object and examined it with a handkerchief. "A wax seal," he said, "same as the one sent to us. This one melted almost to nothing. But look here, the edge was cooled quickly, pressed into the wall." He held it up to the light. "The triangles, but also something new. A crescent, an addition, a variation," Holmes said. "Someone is adapting the symbols. Changing the language." He stood abruptly. "We must see the coroner's report. Winston's death may not have been caused by smoke inhalation." And he was right. The next morning, Lestrade sent word. "Autopsy reveals the cause of death was asphyxiation by an external agent. Chloroform, likely. The fire was post-mortem. Again, another sacrifice to the mythology. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes laid a stack of files across the floor, each bearing a name: MF, Mrs. Fanwick; EB, Elsie Bream; PW, Peter Winston, and several unknowns. One file sat at the center, surrounded by the others, marked simply NG. Nathaniel Griggs was the match, Holmes said. But someone else has become the flame. He gestured toward the outlying files. They're following his framework. That much is certain. But the evolution of the symbols, it suggests a shift in control. Someone has claimed the legacy. A disciple, or a rival, Holmes said. What began as manipulation has become something worse. Belief without the manipulator. He tapped the crescent-marked seal. This symbol, it's older. From Mithraic cults, the crescent and triangle joined signified initiation. Whoever left this meant to mark the scene as sacred. I felt a chill. So someone believes the fire grants something? Power, revelation, immortality, perhaps. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that the idea has taken root. He moved to his desk and retrieved the journal of Mrs. Fanwick. It was fragile now. Its pages dried to a crackle. On the final page she had written in an uncertain hand, "It burns inward first, then upward, always upward." She was quoting Griggs, Holmes said. But she believed it. And now others do as well. Then how do we stop them? Holmes looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the answer already forming in his mind. By finding the one who is spreading the message. He opened a drawer and withdrew a small ledger, his personal record of correspondence. Informants and one-time acquaintances. He flipped through pages until he found what he sought. 3 months ago, a pamphlet appeared in Clerkenwell, printed anonymously. It described a philosophy of fire as truth, dressed in the language of enlightenment. It was dismissed as fringe gibberish, but it bore the triangle seal. He tapped the ledger, and it was typeset by a press owned by a man named Declan Voigt. Voigt's print shop was tucked in a side alley off Holborn, nearly invisible but for the rusted bell hanging over its door. The window was coated in grime. No one had cleaned it in weeks. Holmes stepped inside without knocking. The interior was silent but for the slow creak of the press. A single man worked the lever. He was tall, bearded, with hands ink-stained to the wrist. When he turned, I recognized the look that had haunted both Fenwick and Bream. Eyes not mad but removed. "Mr. Voigt," Holmes said. "We've come about your publication, Ascension Through Flame." Voigt didn't flinch. "I expected you sooner." Holmes tilted his head. "So you admit it?" "I printed the truth," Voigt said. "That is not a crime." "No," Holmes replied. "But what you inspired may be." Voigt stepped away from the press. "I did not kill Winston, nor the others. Yet they read your words, believed your message, performed your rituals. You left symbols at the scenes. You marked them." Voigt smiled faintly. "I didn't mark them, they did. Those who understood." Holmes took a slow breath. "Then let me ask you this, how many more are there? How many who understood?" Voigt looked away. "Tell me," Holmes said, his voice cold and razor-sharp, "or you will be buried beneath the very mythology you claim to reveal." At last, Voigt whispered, "There are 12. 12 what?" "Readers, subjects, not all in London. Griggs sent letters across counties, even into the north. Some replied. Others stayed silent, but all were catalogued." Holmes stepped forward. "Names." Voigt hesitated, then turned to a cabinet and removed a sheaf of paper. Names, addresses, notes beside each in a hand I now recognized from the attic. We had our list. And Holmes, at last, had his closure. That night, as the wind curled round the eaves and Baker Street stood still in the silence of approaching midnight, Holmes placed the final page into his files and tied them closed with a black ribbon. He did not look triumphant. "Will they be stopped?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "We'll send word to the authorities in each region. Scotland Yard will intervene. The fires will die before they start." I watched him light his pipe, his gaze distant. "But even when the flames go out," he said, "the belief remains." He looked to the window, where the lights of the city glowed like distant embers. Griggs wanted to be the match. Voigt wanted to be the messenger. But belief is the kindling. He turned back to me. "Watson, this case is over. But the story it was built upon, that people will follow a lie if it promises meaning, that story never ends." And in the silence that followed, I knew he was right. The fire had burned upward, but its smoke had drifted everywhere. We had contained the blaze. But its shadow would linger, forever. The final days of the fire that burned upwards case passed not with fanfare, but with quiet dispatches, sealed files, and the slow turning of gears behind closed doors. Scotland Yard, armed with the list Holmes had extracted from Declan Voigt, acted swiftly. Raids were conducted across London and beyond, in Kent and York and as far north as the Isle of Man. Pamphlets were seized. Correspondence was confiscated. In some cases, the subjects were found to have moved on, harmless perhaps, or too fractured to carry out what Griggs had begun. But others had already begun their preparations. Thanks to Holmes, they were intercepted in time. Yet in the days that followed, my friend grew quiet, not withdrawn, but introspective, even fragile in a way few would ever perceive. This had not been a case of theft nor blackmail, nor a murder plotted for gain. This had been a study in manipulation, a lesson in how easily the mind could be turned inward and set alight. One rainy morning, as we sat before the hearth, he finally broke the silence. "Watson," he said, "there is something that has long haunted me about this case. Not the fire nor even the deaths, but the precision of it, the way Griggs targeted minds, not bodies. The fire was merely the evidence. The crime happened long before the match was struck." I looked at him over my teacup. "You believe Griggs was testing more than gullibility?" "He was testing conviction," Holmes replied, "to see whether people could be made to believe so fully in fiction that they would act upon it as if it were truth. That is the purest form of power, when the creator of the lie no longer needs to be present for it to endure." He leaned forward slightly. "And what troubles me most is this. He succeeded. He turned belief into action." "Then we were fortunate," I said. "Fortunate that you saw it for what it was before it could spread." But Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. We were thorough. We were swift, but we were not early. Mrs. Fenwick died. Winston died. Others nearly followed. and I fear this may not be the last time we see a flame like this. Griggs was simply one man. What he revealed is a fault line beneath the surface of society itself. He rose then, walked to his desk and retrieved the charred Latin volume once more. With great care he opened it to the final page. There, still etched in faded ink, was Mrs. Fanwick's last note. It burns inward first, then upward, always upward. Holmes studied the line for a long moment, then carefully tore the page from the binding. I blinked. "What are you doing?" He took the page to the fire and placed it gently atop the coals. The ink curled, browned, then vanished in flame. "Let that lie be buried," he said. "We need no monuments to madness." I said nothing, for there was nothing to say. He had burned the last ember of a fire that had taken more than lives. It had scorched the idea of safety itself, that within even the most rational minds, the right whisper at the right moment could kindle something dangerous. As I made ready to leave for my rounds, Holmes turned to me with the faintest of smiles. "Do you know what struck me most about Griggs, Watson?" "What?" He never believed any of it himself. I paused at the door. "Then why go to such lengths?" "Because," Holmes said, "he wanted to prove that others would." He returned to his chair and took up his violin. As the first soft notes echoed through the room, I stepped out into the London mist. The fire behind me finally extinguished, but its lesson indelibly written across our time. The case was closed, but the smoke, like the idea, had left its mark, forever.